Hey, welcome back. Today we'll be covering the stomach. So the folds or rugae are made out of mucosa and submucosa, and those contain the gastric glands. They allow the stomach to expand. The mucosa is going to be simple columnar, and the submucosa will have a dense irregular layer of connective tissue carrying a lot of vessels and nerves. The muscularis is going to contain the adventitia, an inner and external layers, and this doesn't contain any glands. The muscularis externa has the segmental contraction and peristaltic movement, allowing the stomach to churn in like a circular motion. So the inner is going to be a circular layer, and that there's an outer longitudinal layer. And the nerves, you'll go through it more in anatomy, but they're receptive to pain and like distension. So the circular layer will prevent the food from refluxing, and then the longitudinal layer will inchworm the food through. The layers are like spiraled. And then the serosa has a thin connective tissue layer that reduces the friction from peristalsis. And then at the pyloric sphincter, the muscularis propria, the circular layer is going to be a lot thicker. The gastric glands are going to be simple columnar epithelium lining the mucosal surface, and they invaginate inwards into these pits, and those pits are going to be lined with the mucus producing cells, and those will have an opening to the mucosal surface, and they make viscous alkaline mucus, and they're just kind of like squeezed up through the isthmus. And in the neck, there's going to be stem cells that divide asymmetrically. So some of those cells will be saved to make the neuroendocrine cells, and then some of them will be just surface mucosa cells. The progenitor cells will go up to replace the mucus cells every 4 to 7 days. And then they can move downwards to differentiate into the secretory cells. So the cardiac glands is not in the heart; it's in the stomach, and it's at the esophageal gastro junction. And they are simple branched tubular glands with long pits and a coiled secretory portion. So they're kind of be like curled. And those will produce the mucus and the lysozymes, and they have some kind of endocrine cells such as G cells and D cells. The pyloric glands are going to be simple branched tubular glands, and they have long pits and a coiled secretory function, and those will also secrete mucus and lysozymes. Once again, there's no parietal or chief cells. They have more G cells than the fundic glands, and they are stimulated by smell, like the smells of food, the distension in the stomach, and secretagogues. And those are just molecules that stimulate the enteroendocrine cells. The G cells will stimulate the secretion of pepsinogen and acid by the chief cells and the parietal cells. And then the D cells are going to secrete somatostatin. And they are stimulated by acid in the lumen of the stomach and the duodenum. So the D cells are going to be inhibited by gastrin, because gastrin is going to secrete acid. So it's a feedback loop. Once there's too much acid, it's already working, so the food is being emptied into the duodenum, and duodenum tells the body to stop emptying into it's already filled. So the most abundant gland is going to be the principal gland, and that's found at the bottom of the pits. They have the mucous neck cells, the parietal oxyntic cells, the chief zymogenic cells, and the enteroendocrine cells. So they secrete a like whole host of things. So like the chief cells with like acid, and endocrine cells are going to be like hormones, that's such as gastrin, and then the isthmus will have different differentiating mucus cells. So the isthmus will have like a bunch of like a mix of cells in different stages, and then the neck cells will have a bunch of like stem cells, parietal cells, some endocrine cells, while the base has the many enteroendocrine cells, along with like the stem cells to replace all of these. So here you go, the secretory products and the gastric glands. So the mucus neck cells, as you can see right here, and right here. So they look almost foamy in a way. They're just clusters, and they're less columnar than the surface mucus cells, so they're not as tall. And they have like they have a lot of apical secretory granules, and those will produce mucus that have more glycoproteins and less alkaline materials than the surface mucus. The parietal oxyntic cells are going to be in the neck, among the mucus neck cells, and not so much in the basal region. And those will bulge into the lumen, and they contain a round euchromatic central nucleus, so it's very dark, as you can see here, and an eosinic cytoplasm, and something called a halo, and that creates the hydrochloric acid and the intrinsic factor. Okay, so the carbonic anhydride catalyzes water and carbon dioxide into a hydrogen ion and a carbonate, and those cells will also release potassium and chloride. And there is the pump. In order to pump the hydrogen ion into the stomach lumen to exchange with potassium, the chlorine ion will diffuse and combine with hydrogen to make it will make the hydrochloric acid, and the tubular vesicular structures will fuse to make the canaliculus and the microvilli, while the bicarbonate stays in the blood to raise the pH of the mucus. And then all of this is going to be stimulated by the cholinergic nerve endings, and while gastrin and histamine are going to be stimulated by something else, usually some kind of like smell, and that's going to be secreted by the local enteroendocrine cells. And that's just like a complicated way of saying what the oxyntic cells do, and really they're just there for the hydrochloric acid and the intrinsic factor. As you can see from this chart here, sensory afferent, that's usually from smell, activate the vagus nerve, somatostatin, gastrin, and then it'll lead to the parietal cells to start the process of digestion. So the damage to parietal and chief cells will reduce the amount of intrinsic factor. How do you do that? A B12 deficiency, also known as pernicious anemia, because it's going to damage the intrinsic factor, or damage the cells creating the intrinsic factor, and their intrinsic factor either won't be made or it can't bind to B12. Other causes besides being vegan or vegetarian is a large resection of the ileum. This is where B12 is made, and Crohn's disease. Parietal cells, interestingly enough, have a lifespan of a year, while most other cells have 4 days to a week. So the chief zymogenic cells are going to be really predominant in the lower deep basal region of the glands, very close to the muscularis mucosa, and they're kind of in clusters. They have a basal and round euchromatic nuclei, and the cytoplasm is going to be granular with a lot of like protein, also known as like ribosomes or protein building structures. The basal cytoplasm is going to be basophilic, and there's going to be a lot of rough endoplasmic reticular, versus the apical region that's going to be acidophilic, because those contain the zymogen granules that have pepsinogen in it. So pepsinogen is going to be converted into pepsin after being released into the acid environment, and this is going to be the active proteolytic enzyme. Chief cells will also produce gastric lipase, and those will degrade like fats. The enteroendocrine cells are also known as enterochromaffin cells, and those are kind of found all throughout the digestive salt. And they secrete short polypeptide hormones, and the important one to note is it secretes serotonin. But this is very different from the serotonin in your brain. So serotonin secreted by the stomach is going to be used to stimulate other forms of digestion, not boost your mood. Though most people do feel happy when they see food, that's completely different. This is a different pathway. The blood-brain barrier will prevent serotonin and dopamine or whatever other hormones created in the blood or in the stomach from crossing the blood-brain barrier. So in the pylorus, the G cells will make gastrin, and the D cells will make somatostatin. Gastrin will stimulate secretion of acid, and D cells will inhibit the G cells, and that will lead to decrease of acid. Okay, cancer. So carcinoids are going to be tumors from the these are going to be tumors from the epithelial cells, and those are really responsible for the overproduction of serotonin, and the serotonin will increase the gut motility, but they will increase it too much and lead to like mucosal vasoconstriction, or like over constriction and damage. And if you can see here, there's going to be all these like lumps. This should not be there, should be smooth. As you can see here, there's like irregularity. Okay, so that's it for now. Thank you for your attention, and good luck studying.